April 12, 1983. While Michael Jackson's Thriller dominates MTV with million-dollar production values, and the Police perfect their radio-friendly sophistication, a small independent label releases an album that sounds like it was recorded in a swamp. The cover shows no band members, just kudzu vines strangling an abandoned structure. The lead singer mumbles his way through lyrics no one can understand. The guitars jangle like wind chimes. The drums were recorded in an antiquated booth the engineer called the Tiki Hut. Industry executives didn't know what to make of it. College radio stations couldn't decide if it was brilliant or broken. And by year's end, Rolling Stone magazine would name it Album of the Year, beating Thriller, Synchronicity, and U2's War. This is the story of Murmur, the debut album by 4 college kids from Athens, Georgia, who accidentally invented alternative rock by refusing to sound like anyone else. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is R.E.M's. To understand Murmur, you first need to understand Athens, Georgia in 1980, a college town that was quietly becoming America's most unlikely music capital. While punk rock was exploding in New York and Los Angeles, Athens was cultivating something different. The B-52s had already put the town on the map with their quirky new wave hit Rock Lobster in 1979. Art students at the University of Georgia were forming bands in abandoned churches and playing house parties that would become legendary. It was in this scene that 4 young men came together almost accidentally. January 1980. Peter Buck, an Emory University dropout, was working at Wookstree Records, a vinyl shop in downtown Athens. Michael Stipe, an art student at the University of Georgia, walked in regularly. Buck would save records for himself. Patti Smith, television, the Velvet Underground, punk and proto-punk that most customers in this southern college town weren't buying. Stipe, it turned out, was buying all of them. It turns out that I was buying all the records that Buck was saving for himself, Stipe recalled years later. Through a mutual friend named Kathleen O'Brien, Stipe and Buck met 2 other UGA students, Mike Mills and Bill Berry, childhood friends from Macon who had been playing music together since high school. The 4 agreed to jam together. There was never any grand plan behind any of it, Stipe later said. They rehearsed in the deconsecrated St. Mary's Episcopal Church on Oconee Street, a crumbling building that had been converted into student apartments. On April 5, 1980, they played their first public show at O'Brien's birthday party, held in that same church. They still didn't have a name. After considering options like Twisted Kites, Cans of Piss, and Negro Wives, they settled on R.E.M., short for Rapid Eye Movement, the stage of sleep associated with dreaming. It was appropriately mysterious for a band that would make inscrutability their trademark. R.E.M. spent 1980 and early 1981 playing every dive bar and college party they could book, building a cult following in Athens and throughout the South. Their sound was unlike anything else. Buck's jangly Rickenbacker guitar, Mills's melodic bass lines, Berry's economical drumming, and Stipe's mumbled, cryptic vocals. In February 1981, flush with confidence and naivete, they rushed into a recording studio and cut an album's worth of songs in under 6 hours. From that session came their first single, Radio Free Europe, backed with Sitting Still, released in July 1981 on the tiny independent label Hibtone. Only 1,000 copies were pressed, but those 1,000 copies changed everything. College radio stations across America began playing Radio Free Europe. The New York Times included it in their 10 best singles of the year. Music industry insiders began making pilgrimages to Athens to see this mysterious band. One of those cassettes reached Jay Boberg, co-owner of I.R.S. Records, an independent label that had already signed the Go-Go's, the Cramps, and Wall of Voodoo. The thing that made me play the cassette again and again was that it kept getting better, Boberg said. It was not the kind of thing you listened to once or twice casually and said, "Oh my God, this is tremendous." It had a depth to it. Boberg flew to New Orleans to see R.E.M. play live. He offered them a 5-record deal on the spot. In October 1981, the band returned to North Carolina to record with Mitch Easter at his drive-in studio in Winston-Salem, essentially a garage studio Easter had built himself. The result was Chronic Town, a 5-song EP that would be released in August 1982 as R.E.M.'s first official I.R.S. release. The recording sessions were loose and experimental. Easter, a fan of Kraftwerk and experimental music, incorporated tape loops, recorded Stipe singing outdoors, crickets and all, and encouraged the band to cut tape and rearrange pieces. "We knew each other a little, so we did stretch out a bit artistically," Easter recalled. "It was great fun for me. I have better memories of Chronic Town than Radio Free Europe, because doing the single was just a whirlwind. On Chronic Town, we got to actually talk about stuff." The EP sold 20,000 copies in its first year, remarkable for an independent release. Critics were divided. Some college radio programmers didn't know what to make of it, but NME reviewer Richard Grubble praised it. Chronic Town is 5 songs that spring to life full of immediacy and action and healthy impatience. The EP finished second in the Village Voice's prestigious Passenjob Critics poll for 1982. I.R.S. Records now had a decision to make. Was this strange band from Georgia ready to record a full album? December 1982, R.E.M. was ready to record their debut album. I.R.S. Records was ready to make them stars. But there was a problem. I.R.S. wanted a real producer. Mitch Easter was great for an EP, the label reasoned, but he was essentially a guy recording bands in his garage. For a proper album, they needed someone with commercial credentials. Enter Stephen Hague, a rising producer who would go on to work with Pet Shop Boys, New Order, and OMD. Hague specialized in polished, synthesizer-heavy production. His aesthetic was slick, modern, radio-friendly. It was, in other words, the complete opposite of everything R.E.M. stood for. The band agreed to a trial session. They'd record 1 song with Hague. If it worked out, he'd produce the album. They chose Catapult. What happened next nearly broke the band. Hague's approach was methodical, perfectionist, by the numbers. He made the band play the song over and over, by some accounts up to 50 takes, insisting on technical precision and timing that required playing to a click track. For drummer Bill Berry, it was a nightmare. He'd never worked with a metronome before. Take after take, he struggled to match the mechanical timing Hague demanded. His confidence shattered. When the band finally completed the track, Hague took the tapes to Synchro Sound Studios in Boston without telling them. There he added layers of keyboards and synthesizers, the exact sound R.E.M. was trying to avoid. When the band heard the results, they were horrified. The band was probably wise to be wary of producers, since producers are likely to be working more for the man than the band, and their ideas might be really tacky, Mitch Easter later recalled with characteristic understatement. The Hague version of Catapult was, in Easter's words, terrible. For years, R.E.M. refused to let anyone hear it. When a snippet finally leaked decades later, fans understood why. It sounded like a bad Pet Shop Boys B-side. Desperate, the band went to I.R.S. and begged to work with Mitch Easter instead. The label proposed a compromise. Record 1 song with Easter and his production partner Don Dixon. Whichever version was better would determine who produced the album. It wasn't even close. Mitch Easter brought in Don Dixon, a North Carolina musician and producer who had his own band, Arrogance, and a reputation for hands-off, artist-friendly production. The two had complementary skills. Easter was the technical wizard, comfortable with tape manipulation and sonic experiments. Dixon was the musician's producer, focused on capturing performances rather than perfecting them. For the trial session, R.E.M. chose Pilgrimage, a song they'd been playing live for over a year. The session was everything the Hague disaster wasn't. Easter and Dixon set up microphones, let the band play, and captured the energy of their live performance. No metronomes, no synthesizers, no endless takes searching for technical perfection. We, Don Dixon and I, had to show them that we were paying attention to their aesthetic sense instead of imposing something on them, Easter explained. When I.R.S. executives heard both versions, Hague's Catapult and Easter Dixon's Pilgrimage, there was no debate. Even the label had to admit the Easter Dixon version was superior. R.E.M. got the green light to record their debut album with Easter and Dixon. The Pilgrimage recording was so good, it was used almost unchanged on the final album. On January 6, 1983, R.E.M. checked into Reflections Sound Studios in Charlotte, North Carolina for 3 weeks of recording. Reflection was an odd choice for a rock album. The 24-track facility's primary clients were televangelists Jim and Tammy Backer, who used it to record their PTL, Praise the Lord, club broadcasts. The studio had virtually no rock and roll credentials, but that's exactly why it appealed to Peter Buck. We wanted to do it in the South with people who were fresh at making rock and roll records, Buck told Rolling Stone. In Charlotte, we could sit up all night and mess around, have ideas, and not worry too much. The band arrived with clear intentions. After the Stephen Hague experience, they knew what they didn't want. No guitar solos, no synthesizers, no rock cliches, no MTV-ready production. They wanted something that sounded timeless, or at least outside of time. When we were doing Murmur, we knew that it was not going to sound like anything released that year, Buck said. We wanted an air of mystery. We were conscious that we were making a record that really wasn't in step with the times, he added. Most of the songs had been road-tested extensively. The band had already agreed on the track sequence before entering the studio. The basic goal was to capture what they sounded like live, with minimal studio trickery. Dixon and Easter took a deliberately hands-off approach. Being both musicians, our approach was to leave as little imprint as possible, Dixon recalled. The pair would only intervene if something was genuinely substandard. Otherwise, they let the band's instincts guide the recording. But Bill Berry had one non-negotiable demand. He wanted to record his drums in a proper drum booth, even though this was considered outdated by 1983 standards. Reflection Studios had a vintage booth that the engineers affectionately called the Tiki Hut, a small octagonal structure with lots of glass and a cedar shake-pointed roof straight out of the 1970s. It created immediate problems. The booth was so small that Berry's hi-hat seemed to consume the entire drum sound. Easter and Dixon tried everything, including using Dolby A decoding on the bass drum track, which wasn't encoded, to create an expander effect and reduce hi-hat bleed. For Radio Free Europe, they couldn't get a decent snare drum sound no matter what they tried. Finally, in exasperation, Easter grabbed another snare drum and played it himself while Dixon punched him in, adding a second layer for clarity. Michael Stipe had his own quirks. He didn't record vocals in the vocal booth. Instead, he set up on a half-staircase landing that led from the control room down to the studio floor, the opposite end of the room from where his bandmates played. That's where he sang so he could be private and do what he wanted to do, and not feel like people were looking at him, Dixon explained. Stipe would arrive early, sometimes before his bandmates woke up. He'd stand on that staircase, eyes closed, curly blonde hair falling over his forehead, and mumble his way through takes. Dixon and Easter rarely asked for multiple vocal takes. If Stipe delivered the emotional intention of a song, technical imperfections didn't matter. They were almost universally despised by musicians, Dixon recalled years later. Most musicians thought of them as nothing more than a bunch of hack shitheads. They didn't get it. The more accomplished you were, the more you hated R.E.M. It's hard to hear it now in hindsight as it was at the time. Yes. The recording of Murmur has been described as a process of negation. The band and producers actively rejecting every popular production technique of 1983. Synthesizers were dominating radio. R.E.M. used none. Guitar solos were expected in rock songs. Peter Buck played none. Vocals were supposed to be clear and upfront in the mix. Stipe was buried and deliberately indecipherable. Production was supposed to be clean and polished. Murmur sounded murky, atmospheric, almost haunted. This wasn't incompetence, it was philosophy. I don't like to use compressors and take away my textures, one engineer later recalled Hill saying in an unrelated interview about production philosophy that captured the Murmur approach. I was raised on music that was recorded before technology advanced to the place where it could be smooth. I want to hear that thickness of sound. You can't get that from a computer. R.E.M. wanted Murmur to sound like it could have been recorded in any decade, or in no decade at all. Mills's bass carried much of the melody, functioning almost as a counter-lead instrument rather than just providing rhythm. His Rickenbacker had a bright, punchy sound that gave the music its characteristic jangle. Barry's drumming was economical and precise, never flashy but always exactly where it needed to be. Buck's guitar playing borrowed from the Byrds, Television, and the Feelies, arpeggiated chords that chimed and jangled, creating textures rather than riffs. And Stipe's vocals, well, nobody could quite figure out what Stipe was singing. I still have no idea what these songs are about, because neither me nor anyone else I know has ever been able to discern R.E.M.'s lyrics, Cream writer John Morthland wrote in his review. When asked about his indistinct singing style, Stipe was unapologetic. "It's just the way I sing. If I tried to control it, it would be pretty false." Stipe himself later admitted that some of the lyrics were nonsense. In a 1994 online chat discussing Sitting Still from Murmur, he said, "You all know there aren't words per se to a lot of early stuff. But that ambiguity was the point." Stipe's vocals functioned almost instrumentally. The sound and emotion mattered more than literal meaning. In one rare instance of R.E.M. co-writing, Stipe asked his friend Neil Bogan to contribute lyrics to West of the Fields. It remains the only track on the album not solely credited to the four band members. Recording was completed on February 23, 1983, less than 7 weeks after it began. Musically, Murmur defied easy categorization. Critics reached for comparisons. The Byrds' jangle, Patti Smith's poetry, the Velvet Underground's art rock mystique. Some called it folk rock. Others heard post-punk. A few labeled it college rock, a term that would eventually evolve into alternative rock. But as AllMusic's Stephen Thomas Erlewine later wrote, Murmur sounds as if it appeared out of nowhere, without any ties to the past, present, or future. The songs on Murmur sound as if they've existed forever, yet they subvert folk and pop conventions by taking unpredictable twists and turns into melodic, evocative territory. The album sequencing was carefully considered. Radio Free Europe opened side 1 with the album's most accessible track, a re-recorded slightly fuller version of their debut single. This was followed by Pilgrimage, Laughing, Talk About the Passion, Moral Kiosk, and Perfect Circle, the latter featuring piano and a particularly haunting vocal from Stipe. Side 2 opened with Catapult, the song that nearly derailed the entire album during the Hague sessions, now recorded properly. The sequence continued through Sitting Still, 9 to 9, with its nervous post-punk energy, shaking through We Walk, and closed with West of the Fields. The album cover was as enigmatic as the music. Instead of showing the band members, standard practice for debut albums, the cover featured a photograph of kudzu vines completely covering an abandoned structure. Kudzu, an invasive Japanese vine introduced to the American South in the 1800s, grows so rapidly it can consume entire landscapes, earning it the nickname, the vine that ate the South. The image was perfect, mysterious, southern, slightly ominous, and completely ambiguous. Was the kudzu destroying or transforming what it covered? You could stare at that photo for hours and never quite figure out what lay beneath the vines. The back cover showed a railroad trestle, specifically a section of the old Georgia Railroad line into downtown Athens. That trestle would later become a local landmark, affectionately known as the Murmur trestle. When the local government proposed demolishing it years later, public outcry led to its preservation, though it was eventually demolished in 2020. No band photos. No liner notes explaining the songs. Just kudzu and a trestle, as if the music itself should speak even if it spoke in whispers. April 12, 1983. Murmur arrived in record stores. I.R.S. Records didn't have high commercial expectations. They hoped for respectable college radio play and maybe 50,000 copies sold. The critical response was immediate and overwhelming. Rolling Stone gave the album 4 out of 5 stars. Reviewer Steve Pond wrote, "Murmur is the record on which R.E.M. trade that potential for results. An intelligent, enigmatic, deeply involving album, it reveals a depth and cohesiveness to R.E.M. that the EP could only suggest," he concluded. R.E.M. is clearly the important Athens band. The Village Voice's Robert Christgau declared, "They're an art band, nothing more or less, and a damn smart one." In the UK, where R.E.M. had barely any presence, critics were equally enthusiastic. The band hadn't even toured Britain yet, but the British music press embraced Murmur as something genuinely new. Peter Buck recalled I.R.S. being mind-boggled by the positive British reviews for a band that had zero profile across the Atlantic. The re-recorded Radio Free Europe was released as the album's lead single. It peaked at number 78 on the Billboard singles chart, respectable but not spectacular. The album itself performed better, reaching number 36 on the Billboard 200. By the end of 1983, Murmur had sold approximately 200,000 copies. I.R.S.'s Jay Boberg felt this was below expectations, given the critical acclaim. But something else was happening, something that would prove far more significant than chart positions. Murmur was becoming legendary. December 1983. Rolling Stone magazine prepared its year-end critics poll for Album of the Year. 1983 had been an extraordinary year for popular music. Michael Jackson's Thriller was the biggest-selling album of all time, spawning hit after hit. The Police released Synchronicity, their slickest, most commercially successful work. U2 delivered War, establishing them as arena rock contenders. David Bowie released Let's Dance, his biggest commercial success. These were albums with massive budgets, international marketing campaigns, and constant MTV rotation. And then there was Murmur, recorded in 3 weeks at a televangelist studio in Charlotte, North Carolina, by a band nobody outside of college radio had heard of. Rolling Stone named Murmur Album of the Year. It beat Thriller. It beat Synchronicity. It beat War. The magazine also named R.E.M. Best New Artist of 1983. In the Village Voices Paz and Jop poll, arguably even more prestigious among music critics, Murmur finished second for Album of the Year. This was unprecedented. A debut album on an independent label, with virtually no radio play outside college stations, had defeated the biggest pop stars in the world. The decision wasn't about sales. Thriller would sell 32 million copies by the end of 1983. It was about artistry, innovation, and cultural significance. Murmur represented something critics desperately wanted, an alternative to the increasingly corporate, MTV-dominated mainstream. It proved that lo-fi production, cryptic lyrics, and regional authenticity could compete with and defeat polished pop perfection. The album's influence spread immediately. Record labels began signing jangly guitar bands. College radio stations gained credibility and listenership. The term college rock transformed from a niche description into a recognized genre. R.E.M. spent much of 1983 on the road, and their live shows were revelatory. The band had always been a powerful live act. Their cult following in Athens was built on relentless gigging. But with Murmur released, they now had a proper album to tour behind. In March 1983, just before the album's release, they supported the English Beat, known simply as The Beat in the UK, on a lengthy North American tour. This exposed them to larger audiences outside the South for the first time. In October 1983, they made their first national television appearance on Late Night with David Letterman, performing Radio Free Europe and an unreleased song that would appear on their next album. On July 9, 1983, they played Larry's Hideaway in Toronto, a show that was recorded by Blair Packham of the Jitters, and would remain unreleased for 25 years until it appeared on the 2008 Deluxe reissue of Murmur. That Toronto show is a fascinating document. The band sounds tighter and more aggressive than on the studio album. Stipe's vocals are clearer and more upfront. The mysterious atmospheric quality of Murmur gives way to direct, energetic rock and roll. It proved something important. Murmur wasn't just studio trickery. These were genuinely great songs performed by genuinely great musicians. Murmur never sold anywhere close to Thriller numbers. It was eventually certified gold, 500,000 copies shipped in 1991, 8 years after its release. But its influence was immeasurable. The album established the template for alternative rock that would dominate the next decade. Every jangly guitar band that emerged in the mid to late 1980s owed a debt to Murmur. The Smiths, the Stone Roses, Teenage Fan Club, countless others, all walked through doors R.E.M. had opened. When Nirvana, Pixies, and Pavement emerged in the early 1990s and punk-influenced alternative rock exploded into the mainstream, they all cited R.E.M. as pioneers who proved independent music could compete with corporate rock. Kurt Cobain of Nirvana acknowledged R.E.M.'s importance in proving that underground bands could reach wider audiences without compromising their vision. Johnny Marr of the Smiths said in 2018, "As a British musician coming out of the indie scene in the early 80s, which I definitely am and am proud to have been, I can't miss this opportunity to acknowledge and pay my respects and honor the guys who put this town on the map for us in England. I'm talking about my comrades in guitar music, R.E.M. Even Cliff Burton of Metallica, about as far from college rock as you could get, cited R.E.M. as one of his favorite bands in the mid-1980s. The album's critical reputation has only grown over time. In 1989, Rolling Stone rated it number 8 on their list of the 100 greatest albums of the 1980s. In 2003, it was ranked number 197 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. By the 2020 revision, it had climbed to number 165. VH1 named it the 92nd greatest album of all time. It was included in the book 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. In 2025, Radio X included Murmur in its list of the 25 best indie debut albums of the 1980s. But perhaps the most telling measure of the album's importance came in 1987, just 4.5 years after Murmur's release. Rolling Stone put R.E.M. on its cover with a bold declaration, "America's best rock and roll band." Their fifth album, Document, had just reached number 10 on the Billboard 200. Within another 5 years, with albums like Out of Time and Automatic for the People, they would become one of the biggest bands on the planet. But it all started with Murmur. What made Murmur revolutionary wasn't what it did, it was what it refused to do. It refused to use synthesizers when synthesizers dominated radio. It refused to feature guitar solos when guitar solos were expected. It refused to make the lyrics clear when clarity was the norm. It refused to polish the production when slickness was in fashion. It refused to put the band members on the cover when debut albums were supposed to introduce faces to match the names. Every refusal was a declaration, "We're going to do this our way." Mitch Easter and Don Dixon's hands-off production philosophy proved crucial. By refusing to impose their vision on the band, they allowed R.E.M.'s vision to emerge naturally. It was a unique combination of people, where there was enough tension and enough cohesiveness, Dixon told Rolling Stone. We were dealing with a fragile sort of art concept and trying to bring in a little pop sensibility without beating it up. The Stephen Hague disaster could have destroyed the album before it began. Instead, it clarified exactly what R.E.M. needed. Producers who understood that technical perfection would kill what made the band special. Bill Berry's insistence on recording in that antiquated drum booth, despite the technical problems it created, exemplified the band's commitment to their aesthetic over industry standards. Michael Stipe's mumbled, cryptic vocals turned what could have been a liability into the album's signature. Critics who complained they couldn't understand him missed the point. The ambiguity was the art. As one later critic wrote, Stipe's vocals functioned almost instrumentally. The sound and emotion mattered more than literal meaning. Listening to Murmur today, you can hear all its imperfections. The hi-hat bleeds into the drum mics. The vocals are sometimes barely audible. The mix is murky. The recording quality is lo-fi even by 1983 standards. But those flaws are what make the album timeless. Overproduced albums sound dated because production techniques evolve. But Murmur was already outside of time when it was made. It didn't sound like 1983. It didn't sound like any particular era. Stephen Thomas Erlewine captured this perfectly. Murmur sounds as if it appeared out of nowhere, without any ties to the past, present, or future. The album's sequencing is nearly perfect. The flow from Radio Free Europe through Pilgrimage and Laughing establishes the template. Talk About the Passion offers a moment of stark beauty. Perfect Circle provides the emotional centerpiece. Side 2 opens with Catapult, the song that almost destroyed the album, now reclaimed and transformed. 9 to 9 brings nervous post-punk energy. We Walk offers playful release, and West of the Fields closes with appropriate mystery. Individual highlights are beside the point. Murmur works as a complete experience. It's not an album you put on for one song. It's an album you sink into, letting the atmosphere wash over you. The Murmur sessions were by all accounts relatively painless, especially compared to the nightmare of working with Stephen Hague. But there was pressure. I.R.S. Records had invested in the band. The Chronic Town EP had sold well and generated critical buzz. The label needed the album to succeed, or R.E.M. might remain a cult act forever. The band recorded quickly, efficiently, professionally. Most tracks were captured in just a few takes. The looseness and spontaneity that defined Chronic Town carried over to Murmur, but with better equipment and more time to refine ideas. We cut 6 songs in 3 days, Peter Buck recalled. We were pretty efficient. The budget was modest, around $12,000 for the entire album. By comparison, major label releases in 1983 routinely cost 10 to 20 times that amount. But the low budget forced creative solutions. The band couldn't afford extensive overdubs or studio experimentation. They had to capture performances live with minimal correction. That limitation became the album's strength. Unlike the Stephen Hague sessions, where perfectionism crushed spontaneity, the Murmur sessions preserved the energy and accidents that make recordings feel alive. When Easter couldn't get a good snare sound on Radio Free Europe, he played a second snare himself rather than spending hours chasing the perfect mic placement. When Steep's vocals came out mumbly and indistinct, Dixon and Easter left them that way rather than demanding clarity that would have felt forced. The album they created wasn't perfect. It was better than perfect. It was authentic. Murmur arrived at exactly the right moment to ride and accelerate a cultural shift happening on college campuses across America. Throughout the early 1980s, college radio stations had been quietly building an alternative to top 40 and album-oriented rock, AOR formats. Stations like WUOG in Athens, W.R.A.S in Atlanta, WPRB in Princeton, KCRW in Los Angeles, and WFMU in New Jersey were playing music the mainstream ignored. Post-punk from England, hardcore punk from America, new wave, reggae, and oddball independent releases. R.E.M. became college radio's biggest success story. Proof that this underground network could break artists without MTV or commercial radio support. Radio Free Europe became ubiquitous on college stations months before Murmur was released. When the album arrived, stations added multiple tracks to their playlists, something they rarely did with albums. College radio gave Murmur the oxygen it needed. Without that support, the album would have disappeared regardless of critical acclaim. Commercial radio wasn't touching it. MTV was focused on artists with big budgets for music videos. Traditional rock stations dismissed it as too weird, too soft, too arty. But on college campuses, Murmur was everywhere. It became the soundtrack of dorm rooms, late-night study sessions, and campus parties. Students who felt alienated by mainstream culture found something that spoke to them, even if they couldn't quite understand what it was saying. The album helped legitimize college radio as a cultural force. When Rolling Stone named Murmur Album of the Year over Thriller, it validated what college radio programmers had been saying all along. Commercial success and artistic merit weren't the same thing. By the late 1980s, the term college rock had evolved into alternative rock, a genre that would explode into the mainstream in the 1990s. Every band that benefited from that explosion owed a debt to R.E.M. and Murmur. Murmur also cemented Athens, Georgia as America's most unlikely music capital. The B-52s had put Athens on the map in 1979 with Rock Lobster. But they were seen as a quirky one-off, a weird new wave band from the South. R.E.M.'s success with Murmur proved Athens wasn't a fluke. There was something in the water. In the years following Murmur, Athens bands proliferated. Love Tractor, Pylon, The Side Effects, Dreams So Real, Guadalcanal Diary. Record labels began signing Athens bands simply because they were from Athens, hoping to find the next R.E.M. The scene was tight-knit but not insular. Bands shared equipment, played on each other's records, promoted each other's shows. The competitive toxicity that characterized punk scenes in New York and LA was largely absent. Part of Athens' appeal was its isolation. Unlike New York, LA, or even Atlanta, Athens had no established music industry. There were no A&R executives, no managers, no promotion companies. Musicians could develop without industry pressure, playing for local audiences who cared more about the music than marketability. The University of Georgia provided a constant stream of new audiences. Students came and went, but the scene remained. R.E.M. never forgot where they came from. Even as they became one of the biggest bands in the world, they maintained homes in Athens. Peter Buck continued shopping at Wookstree Records, the store where he'd met Michael Stipe. When asked about Athens in later years, the band always emphasized the freedom the town provided. Athens gave us space to be weird, Buck said. Nobody was telling us we had to sound like anything else. One myth about Murmur needs to be addressed. It wasn't an overnight success. By the time the album was released in April 1983, R.E.M. had been touring relentlessly for 3 years. They'd played hundreds of shows, dive bars, house parties, college venues, opening slots for bigger bands. They'd released a single on an independent label that became a cult hit. They'd released an EP that sold 20,000 copies and finished second in the Village Voice Critics poll. When Murmur arrived, R.E.M. already had a dedicated fan base across the South and significant buzz in the music press. The album didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of work. This is important because Murmur is often held up as proof that great art will find its audience naturally, but that's not quite true. Great art needs infrastructure. College radio, independent labels, music journalists, committed managers, and relentless touring. I.R.S. Records provided the infrastructure. Jay Boberg believed in the band enough to sign them despite their uncommercial sound. The label supported them through the Stephen Hague disaster and gave them creative freedom to make the album they wanted. Jefferson Holt and Burtis Downs, the band's managers, worked tirelessly to book shows, negotiate contracts, and protect the band's interests. They became the fifth and sixth members of R.E.M., essential to the band's success. College radio programmers took risks playing music that sounded like nothing else on their stations. Music journalists championed the album in the face of reader skepticism, and R.E.M. themselves never stopped working. Between January and December 1983, they played over 120 shows. Murmur succeeded because all these elements aligned. Take away any one piece, the label support, the college radio, the management, the touring, and the story might have ended very differently. Let's talk about the actual songs on Murmur, what they sound like, what they might mean, and why they endure. Radio Free Europe opens the album with its most accessible moment. The re-recorded version is fuller than the original Hibtone single, with more prominent backing vocals from Mills and Berry. But it maintains the urgent, jittery energy that made the original compelling. Lyrically, it's characteristically opaque. Something about calling out in transit, and frustration. Keep me out of this and I won't preach. The title references Radio Free Europe, the U.S. government-funded broadcaster that transmitted news into Soviet territories during the Cold War. But whether Stipe is making a political statement or just liked the phrase remains unclear. Pilgrimage follows with one of the album's most driving rhythms. Berry's drums lock into a hypnotic pattern, while Buck's guitar creates a shimmering circular riff. Stipe's vocals are particularly buried here, adding to the dreamlike quality. The lyrics suggest religious imagery. They called the clip a two-headed cow, mixed with journey metaphors. But as usual, Stipe leaves interpretation open. Laughing showcases Mills's melodic bass playing, which functions almost as a lead instrument. The song has an unsettling, nervous energy, like something terrible is about to happen but never quite does. Stipe sings about Laocoon, the Trojan priest from Greek mythology who warned against the Trojan horse. It's one of the album's more decipherable lyrics, though what it means in context remains mysterious. Talk About the Passion offers one of the album's few moments of lyrical clarity. Stipe sings about hunger and poverty with unusual directness. Not everyone can carry the weight of the world. The music is stark and beautiful, with Buck's guitar creating a delicate, ringing texture. It's the closest Murmur comes to being overtly political. Moral Kiosk returns to Enigma. The title alone is pure Stipe, a phrase that sounds meaningful but resists definition. The music is more aggressive, with Buck's guitar cutting through the mix more sharply. Berry's drumming drives hard while Mills provides melodic counterpoint. Perfect Circle closes side one with one of Stipe's most affecting vocal performances. The addition of piano, played by an uncredited session musician, gives the song a haunting quality unlike anything else on the album. Lyrically, it deals with loss and memory, though characteristically obliquely. The song became a fan favorite and a staple of R.E.M's live shows for years. Catapult opens side 2, the song that nearly destroyed the album during the Hague sessions. In Easter and DIXON'S hands, it becomes a showcase for the band's interplay. The rhythm section locks into a complex pattern while Buck's guitar dances around it. Stipe's vocals are particularly mumbly here, leading one early reviewer to joke that the lyrics were, "Did we miss anything? Did we miss anything? Catapult, catapult. Years later, Stipe confirmed those weren't the actual lyrics, but he'd never bothered to correct the misconception. Sitting Still is one of the album's more straightforward rockers, with an almost pop sensibility beneath its murky production. The lyrics deal with frustration and stasis. This name I got, we all were green, C could be standing still. Stipe later admitted the lyrics were partially nonsense, written quickly to fill space. 1909 brings post-punk nervous energy to the album's second half. The title refers to 1909, the year the building in downtown Athens that housed several student apartments, including where the band rehearsed, was built. The song captures urban paranoia and restless youth with jittery rhythms and anxious vocals. Shaking Through features some of Buck's most intricate guitar work on the album, delicate arpeggiated patterns that create an almost hypnotic effect. The song builds gradually, with Mills and Berry adding subtle dynamics. Lyrically, it seems to deal with emergence or transformation. Could it be that one small voice doesn't count in the room? We Walk provides a moment of lightness late in the album. It's almost playful, with a bouncing rhythm and Stipe's vocals more upfront than usual. The song deals with forward movement and determination, appropriate for its placement near the album's end. West of the Fields closes Murmur with appropriate mystery. It's the only track on the album with outside lyrical contributions, from Stipe's friend Neil Bogan. And it shows. The lyrics are slightly more narrative than Stipe's typical abstraction. The music is contemplative, with Buck's guitar creating a shimmering landscape. As the song fades, so does the album, leaving listeners in a place both familiar and strange. For all the analysis of Murmur, one aspect rarely gets discussed, what the band members weren't saying publicly. Michael Stipe was gay, though he wouldn't come out publicly until 1994. In 1983, being openly gay in the music industry, particularly in rock, was still largely taboo. Elton John had come out in 1976 and seen his career temporarily derailed. Freddie Mercury was still deeply closeted and would remain so until shortly before his death in 1991. Stipe's cryptic, ambiguous lyrics weren't just an aesthetic choice. They were also protection. He could write about emotions and experiences without revealing too much about himself. The rest of the band protected Stipe's privacy fiercely. In interviews, they deflected personal questions and focused on the music. This created an air of mystery that served the band well commercially, but it also came from a real need for self-protection. It's impossible to separate Murmur from this context. The album's refusal to be direct, its embrace of ambiguity, its resistance to clear meaning, all of this served multiple purposes simultaneously. Years later, after coming out, Stipe reflected on this period. I think there was always a protective veil between me and the world. The lyrics were one aspect of that. Understanding this doesn't diminish Murmur, it deepens it. The album's emotional resonance comes partly from Stipe's ability to express vulnerability and longing without being explicit. Listeners could project their own meanings onto the songs, finding personal significance in the spaces between words. The success of Murmur created immediate pressure. Could they do it again? I.R.S. Records wanted a follow-up quickly, hoping to capitalize on the critical momentum. R.E.M. returned to the studio in summer 1984 to record their second album, Reckoning. They chose to work again with Mitch and Don Dixon at Reflection Sound Studios, the exact same setup that produced Murmur. The thinking was simple. If it worked once, why change? But Reckoning faced a problem Murmur didn't. Expectations. Critics who embraced Murmur were now watching closely. Would the band mature? Would they clarify their sound? Would they sell out? R.E.M's solution was characteristically stubborn. They made Murmur Part 2. Reckoning, released in April 1984, almost exactly 1 year after Murmur, was brighter and slightly more upbeat than its predecessor, but it maintained the same aesthetic: jangly guitars, murky production, mumbly vocals, cryptic lyrics. Critics were divided. Some praised the band for refusing to compromise. Others accused them of treading water. Reckoning peaked at number 27 on the Billboard 200, 9 spots higher than Murmur. It sold roughly 200,000 copies in its first year, matching its predecessor. But it didn't win Album of the Year from Rolling Stone. It didn't generate the same level of critical obsession. The element of surprise was gone. R.E.M. would spend the next several years figuring out how to evolve without abandoning what made them special. Their third album, Fables of the Reconstruction, 1985, was darker and more challenging. Recorded in England with Joe Boyd, it alienated some fans while winning others. Their fourth album, Life's Rich Pageant, 1986, was brighter and more direct. Stipe's vocals were finally intelligible, and the production by Don Gehman was noticeably clearer. Their fifth album, Document, 1987, broke them into the mainstream. It reached number 10 on the Billboard 200 and spawned the radio hit The One I Love. By their sixth album, Green, 1988, they were signing with Warner Brothers Records for a reported $10 million, one of the biggest record deals of the decade. Each album moved them further from Murmur, yet each was built on the foundation Murmur established: artistic integrity, refusal to compromise, trust in their own vision. In 2008, 25 years after its original release, Capital I.R.S. issued a deluxe edition of Murmur. The reissue included the original album remastered, plus a disc of demos and the complete July 9, 1983 concert from Larry's Hideaway in Toronto. The demos revealed how fully formed the songs were before entering the studio. Rough versions of Pilgrimage, Catapult, and Sitting Still already contained the essential elements that made the album versions compelling. The Toronto concert captured the band at the moment of Murmur's release. Energized, confident, and tighter than their studio recordings suggested. Stipe's vocals were clearer and more forceful. Buck's guitar playing was more aggressive. The mysterious atmosphere of the album gave way to direct rock power. For fans who only knew R.E.M. from their later, more polished work, the deluxe edition was a revelation. Here was proof that the band had always been skilled musicians, and the lo-fi aesthetic of Murmur was a deliberate choice, not a limitation. Critical reassessment in the 2000s and 2010s placed Murmur in proper historical context. It wasn't just a great album, it was a crucial inflection point in American rock music. Before Murmur, independent music was largely ghettoized. After Murmur, it became a viable commercial path. The album proved that artists could maintain creative control, work with independent labels, avoid mainstream radio, and still reach significant audiences. When Nirvana signed to a major label in 1991 and Nevermind exploded, they were following a path R.E.M. had cleared. When Pavement released Slanted and Enchanted in 1992, they were working in a lo-fi tradition Murmur helped establish. When Modest Mouse signed to Epic in 2000, they were benefiting from infrastructure R.E.M. built. The success of Murmur should have launched Mitch Easter and Don Dixon into the top tier of rock producers. Instead, their careers followed more modest trajectories. Easter continued running his drive-in studio in North Carolina, producing records for Let's Active, his own band, Pavement, Wilco, and numerous other indie acts. He never sought major label clients or tried to replicate the Murmur sound on other artists' records. I think the lesson of Murmur is that you have to serve the artist, Easter reflected years later. What worked for R.E.M. wouldn't work for anybody else. Dixon also continued as a producer, working with the Smithereens, Marty Jones, and other acts. He released several solo albums that showcased his own songwriting and musical skills. Neither Easter nor Dixon became wealthy from Murmur. Their production fees were modest, and the album's sales, while impressive for an indie release, didn't generate the kind of money that major label blockbusters did. But both men expressed pride in the album and satisfaction with how it was made. "We captured something real," Dixon said. "That's all you can hope for as a producer." When R.E.M. moved on to work with other producers, there was no bad blood. The band recognized that Easter and Dixon were perfect for their early work, but that continued evolution required different collaborators. R.E.M. reunited with Easter for one track on their 1996 album New Adventures in Hi-Fi, a full-circle moment that acknowledged his importance to their foundation. Stephen Hague, meanwhile, went on to massive commercial success. After the disastrous R.E.M. session, he produced Pet Shop Boys' West End Girls, 1985, a #1 hit on both sides of the Atlantic. He worked with New Order on Technique, 1989, OMD on Crush, 1985, and Erasure on multiple albums. His slick, synthesizer-heavy production style defined much of 1980s pop. He became one of the decade's most in-demand producers. But Catapult remained a black mark on his resume, a rare failure in an otherwise successful career. When the story of the Hague sessions eventually became public, it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of imposing a producer's vision on an artist. To Hague's credit, he never publicly blamed R.E.M. for the failed collaboration. In rare interviews where the subject came up, he acknowledged that his approach wasn't right for the band. "I was trying to make them into something they weren't," he admitted years later. That's always a mistake. The Hague version of Catapult remained unreleased for decades, becoming almost mythical among R.E.M. fans. When snippets finally leaked online in the 2000s, they confirmed everything the band and Easter and Dixon had said. It was terrible. The song that should have been moody and atmospheric sounded like a bad Duran Duran B-side. The synthesizers overwhelmed Buck's guitar. Barry's drums were mechanically precise but lifeless. Stipe's vocals were buried under layers of unnecessary production. It was the anti-Murmur, proof that more doesn't equal better. For all of Murmur's success, the album took a personal toll on the band members, though in ways that wouldn't become apparent for years. The relentless touring schedule of 1983, over 120 shows in 12 months, was exhausting. The band lived on a tour bus, ate bad food, slept little, and dealt with constant travel stress. Michael Stipe, in particular, struggled with the demands of promotion. He was introspective and shy by nature, uncomfortable with the interview process and the increasing attention. The ambiguity that served him well as a lyricist became a burden when journalists demanded explanations. Bill Berry later said that the years between 1983 and 1985 were a blur of constant motion. The pressure to follow up Murmur with something equally acclaimed weighed heavily. When Reckoning didn't receive the same rapturous critical response, there was frustration and disappointment, even though the album sold well and the band's audience continued to grow. By the time they recorded Fables of the Reconstruction in 1985, the band was burnt out. The sessions in England were difficult, marked by tension and homesickness. The resulting album was darker and more claustrophobic than anything they'd done before, a reflection of the band's mental state. In later interviews, all four members pointed to Fables as their lowest point, the moment they almost broke up. They survived and went on to massive success. But the seeds of future problems were planted during those early years of constant touring and creative pressure. Bill Berry would suffer a brain aneurysm on stage in 1995 and retire from the band in 1997, citing the physical toll of decades of touring. Michael Stipe would become more reclusive even as R.E.M. became more famous, carefully controlling his public image and limiting media access. Success at a young age, even the modest success Murmur brought, came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. Murmur turns 42 years old in 2025. Most of the people discovering it now weren't born when it was released. Yet it sounds timeless, neither dated nor contemporary, existing in its own temporal space. You can hear its influence everywhere in modern indie rock. The jangly guitars, the mumbly vocals, the lo-fi production, the embrace of ambiguity, the refusal to explain. Bands that have never heard Murmur are making music that sounds like Murmur because the album's aesthetic has been so thoroughly absorbed into alternative rock's DNA. The album proved several things that seem obvious now, but were revolutionary in 1983. Independent labels could release commercially successful albums. College radio could break artists without mainstream radio support. Lo-fi production wasn't a limitation. It was an aesthetic choice. Cryptic lyrics weren't a failure of communication, they were an invitation to interpretation. Regional scenes outside New York and LA could produce world-class artists. Commercial success and artistic integrity weren't mutually exclusive. Every one of these lessons opened doors for artists who came after. Without Murmur, the alternative rock explosion of the 1990s might not have happened, or might have happened very differently. The album's legacy isn't just musical, it's institutional. Murmur helped create the infrastructure that supports independent music today. College radio networks, indie label distribution, music journalism that values artistry over commerce, touring circuits built on small venues and grassroots promotion. R.E.M eventually became one of the biggest bands in the world, selling over 85 million albums and winning multiple Grammys. But they never made another album quite like Murmur. They couldn't. Murmur captured a specific moment. 4 young men discovering their sound before fame complicated everything, before expectations hardened into obligations. It's the sound of possibility, of refusal, of mystery, of 4 people in a room making something that sounded like nothing else. And 42 years later, it still does. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And Murmur whispers its story still, if you listen closely enough.